Welcome to today's First Chesapeake Chat session. I'm Emma Hollencheck, a member of the 2021 First Chesapeake Alumni Ambassador Cohort, sponsored by Booz Allen Hamilton, and I'm here to introduce the First Chesapeake Chat sponsored by Newport News Shipbuilding. I'd like to thank this session's sponsor, Newport News Shipbuilding, for making this chat possible. Just some housekeeping, we will let the speakers present and then open up for discussion questions later on if there's time, but feel free to put questions in the comments throughout the chat and we'll try to get to them all. The session today is Learn Something New, virtual presentation tips for teams. And I will now pass it over to Rohit and Rose to introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Rose Young. You've seen me before on some chats. If you've been watching them, I work for First Chesapeake as FTC team liaison. And I'm here with Rohit, who's also an alumni ambassador. So we have two alumni ambassadors, and I'll let him say a few things about him. This presentation is really for him. I'm just here in case there's some questions that come up that aren't related to his presentation that he needs a little backup on. So Rohit, take it away.
Thank you, Rose, and thank you, Emma, also to your previous introduction. So we're going to talk a little today about both FTC and FRC presentations. And I'm going to be using a variety of examples, some of them even from FLL presentations, where honestly, I feel like that's where we get the best presentations of all. But we're going to have a wide variety, and we're going to talk about maybe some of the things that make a best presentation overall, but also some of the things that are going to be particularly important when we go to the virtual space, which has a whole new level of complexity to the entire presentation aspect. So let's first talk for a few minutes about why is the presentation important in the first place? Like some teams think like it's just something you go to the competition and you do, and whatever comes of it, comes of it. I love the presentation because, it's so egalitarian in the sense that sometimes you have the best robot there, but sometimes you don't. But your presentation equalizes it for all the teams. There's no advantage for a team that's richer or a team that has had a longer season or got an earlier introduction to robotics. As long as you can sell your own personal story, the presentation can go great. I've had a robot that's completely dead sit on the field and still won an award because we were able to demonstrate why it sat on the field and what it would have done if it hadn't. So let's talk a little bit about some of the great aspects of a good presentation. So the big idea you want to come to is prioritization. You have so little time with the judge, and the judge also has so many teams to go through, and you just want to get the most important parts out there. So prioritizing the things you're going to talk about. Often, the things you want to tell the judge about aren't the things you worked hardest on. Sometimes they're going to be the things that are just unique to your team. If you have a robot with several mechanisms, but you worked really hard on a mechanism, but a lot of teams at the competition have that mechanism, maybe you don't want to spend as much time on it and instead focus on something that was maybe easier to do, but your team did in a particularly innovative way. And that goes also to when we're talking about outreach or other types of presentations, right? Like maybe you spend all this year getting lots of great new sponsors and you should definitely shout them out, but maybe there's a particularly impactful event that you did that other teams might not have done. That's what you should talk about in your presentation. So we're going to talk about three aspects: what you should look like, what you should sound like, and what you should show to judges. So first, we have a link here on screen. I'm sure we can get that to you in some other way, but these are some of First's own tips on how to make a great presentation. And the number one tip is to make a PowerPoint. Now, I would advise that in any scenario, you want a visual to back up what you're saying, but especially this year, it's First's guidance that you want a PowerPoint to show. And it's actually pretty different in the virtual space, because if we were here in physical real life, there was a presentation board behind me and I'm talking, maybe I can be the most dominant figure in the room despite the fact that the presentation board is behind me. But when you have a scenario like this, like the one I'm showing you today, I'm in this tiny box on the side of the screen and the presentation is taking up all the space, that's what's going to catch the judge's eye. And you can't really have any dissonance between what the presentation is saying and what you're saying, because the presentation is going to win and you're going to lose in that scenario, which is not what you want to be. Just going through quickly a few of First's other points. You should have an agenda and you should practice for it, right? It's not enough to just go and impromptu. And one thing I found really useful, like set aside 1 minute for this topic, 1 minute for this topic, 1 minute for this topic, and cut yourself off as it goes over. That's not the type of thing that loses you points, cutting yourself off abruptly. What is going to lose you points is not getting to the most important parts that you want to show the judges. So keep yourself to a very tight schedule and practice many times. Also give everyone a job. I've been on enough robotics teams to know that some people do more presentation work than others, but you really have to sell the part that everyone is a part of the team. And it's not just giving someone a script at the last minute. Everyone should have an area of expertise, so when the questions come, you can spread the questions around and not just have them gravitate towards one or two people. We've gone over practicing also, but also practicing with the technology. Fumbling is both too common these days and not really a good thing that you want to be in your precious 5 minutes of screen time. Let's spend a little time talking here about like what your visuals should look like. So my room is practically a blank void at the moment. Doesn't have to be your room, but you should make sure you have a relatively clean background. There are things that are distracting the judges, and teams, especially at robotics competitions, are very good at uniformity in real life, right? Like you all wear the team shirts, it's great, it's fantastic, it's professional. You have to bring that same uniformity to the virtual session. And sometimes that's a little bit more complex, right? Because you could all be wearing the same shirt, but if the camera angles don't show it, then like you take it off. So make sure you have approximately the same angle. And one idea I heard that I thought was great, like sometimes like people have their camera angle tilted like this, you can't really see the shirt. So maybe have some team headdresses. These are like great ways to get creative this year in terms of uniformity. There's so many different options. So like those are just some of the things. And introductions are at the beginning of the presentation. Make sure you go through them quickly. Like, we love you, you're interesting people, but like you have to get through the stuff so you can talk about the things that are gaining you points, right? So quickly go through your names. I remember there was one presentation a few years ago where each team member said the next person's name. The judge was talking about it for years after that. Maybe that's a great tip for you. But either way, go through it quickly and get to the most important parts of your presentation. So now we're going to go through a few slides, like see some good ones, see some bad ones. All of these slides are mine, so it's all my fault, all my credit. So I'm not throwing anyone else under the bus. So like, let's look here when you're trying to show a feature of the robot. And I'm trying not to get the bar to show up, but when you're trying to see, we're talking about these launch rings over here. I like this because it shows how the feature is evolved, and the judge can see very visually, and when you talk about it, it's going to correlate exactly what you're doing. Same one here, this is from an FLL team, you can see, but there's a little bit of text on the slide, but it's just taking you from version to version to version. What do versions show? They highlight the newest features, which are going to be the most interesting features, in a way the judge can really see them clearly. So that's the type of thing a good evolution slide is going to show. A slide that's not working so well is this wall of text over here. There's a lot of interesting information there, right? But if the judge starts reading, they're not listening, you're not getting all the information you want through, and you definitely shouldn't be reading off the slide. So one thing, you have this engineering portfolio that you're giving in. The information that you want should be in there somewhere. You can reference to pages maybe. So there are things you can do to get like detailed statistics in there. Don't put it on the big slide where the judge is going to get distracted by it. Okay, and let's look at some slides about robot evolution as a whole. Again, here on the right-hand side, 2 slides, they show an incredibly complex robot, but what's the judge supposed to learn from this? Like, so many things have changed between these 2 pictures, right? You can't really sense like all of the innovative parts, and sometimes a diagram is better than a picture in this sense to see like what is the most changing. And that's a good engineering notebook trick in general, right? Like we all have cameras these days, we can paste pictures in easily, but diagrams show what you're trying to do, which is what you're eventually going to be trying to sell to the judges. Again, you can see on the left, there's a mix of CAD, photographs, team members working, a few statistics, right? And you're going through each part of the robot, which gives you a lot more room to eventually to talk about what are the most interesting parts and skip through the parts that are maybe important to show but less interesting in terms of novelty from the other teams. programming is the bane of presentation makers everywhere. How do you show the incredible complexity in such a limited format? So the one thing not to show is a screenshot of your code. It never shows what you think it does, especially it never shows what the programmer thinks it does. So then let's look at the left-hand slide, which is again not perfect. There's too much text there, but at least what it's focusing on is the functionality of it rather than what you are doing. For some experienced programmers, right, like you're trying to show the pseudocode rather than the nitpicky details of how it actually works. And finally, we want to. One interesting thing that I saw, and this is especially common in FLL teams, is like you can make a flowchart of how your programming works, which is a few extra steps, but like that, if you have a really programming heavy team, spend the time and put that on your slide. Telling stories, like these are such interesting things to talk to the judges. They're the most engaging parts of a presentation. But what you don't want to do is like write the story on the slide. I couldn't find a bad slide for the for this particular one because stories are just so engaging. But you know, based on all of the like ticks that we've already gone through, some of the things you shouldn't be doing. But pictures, things that hook the judges into the story, make the judges interested, and then continue on. Make sure not to spend too much time on that and to get to the next part. But this is a great feature to your presentations. And finally, we're going to do a lot of outreach presentations this year, especially in the FRC side. We always do a lot of outreach presentations, but they're particularly important. Lots of pictures are always great for outreach events. And both of these slides are good in different ways. But the one thing that I prefer about the right-hand side is it shows the actual people you're interacting with. That's the thing you want when you have an outreach picture. Now, I know this year, outreach events are going to be different, maybe not as crowded. You know, I still look at these pictures and my first thought is like, why aren't they wearing masks, right? Several years in the past. But either way, there are ways to show all the people you're interacting with rather than just you and just telling them you're in this scenario. And so those are just some of the visual tricks you can use to try to emphasize the parts of your presentation. So we've gone through what you should look like, what you should sound like, and what you should show to the judges. So I think please do reference back to the blog post I gave. It has some sheets, which I'm not sure I can answer questions about specifically because those are relatively new to this year, but I think we'll now field questions from people about different aspects of the presentation process, and I will do my best to answer them. Otherwise, I'll pass it off to Rose, who I'm sure will do a far more informed job.
Well, I see that I think folks have been really interested in hearing this. It's kind of difficult to focus on it when you haven't done it. I think if we had some experience with this, it would be a little bit different. You'd have your own experience to draw on in terms of doing this sort of presentation online. But that's okay. We're all going to get there. One of the things that you might have questions about that really isn't related to the content of the presentation is how you share your portfolio and how that's going to be set up. I would advise you to stick around if you have some questions about how that works, a couple of the mechanics. The next chat, we're going to have an extra chat here tonight going from 7 to 7:30 about the upcoming events. So there are many, many things that we're going to be learning together as we go through this process because it's new. There are some new websites that are out there. There's some new tools that are out there for teams to learn about. And those are going to be more familiar to us, just like going to our normal events was familiar to us before. We would know how our judging was set up and go in the room and all those kinds of things. But we're going to have to learn about that together. Just the core of the presentation, though, I loved a lot of the tips that Rohit gave, not only for this year, but in general. Like there's some really good recommendations for presentations. And as a teacher, I would always say, you know, please do not read me your slides. I was so glad you said that's like the best advice. Do not read the slides. You know, there should be some content there, and you're adding to it. Okay, so I just wanted to add that, and there's a question about, will the judges look at a 1-minute overview, or should we ask to show it? And I think you're talking specifically about for specific awards. Is that in general? There are 3 submissions that you can do for FTC. So there are going to be other submissions for FRC. So specifically for FTC, if you are making a presentation that the judges have to review, do not assume that they have seen it beforehand, but that if it was submitted, that they will see it. So my recommendation on that would be to say, make a point of saying that you submitted. You can even mention that you submitted a control award. And that way, if something happened and they didn't see it, you've mentioned it, and somebody's going to go look and see what happened with your control award submission or any other special submissions that you have. But really, your 5 minutes in that initial, and it will be a longer than 5-minute window, right? But that's your introduction. So always start out like you're introducing yourself. Some of the judges may have been shifted around and kind of just coming into it a little bit later than others. So start out like you're introducing yourself.
Awesome. Yeah, I think we have another question. What is the medium for the judging call? Has that been decided yet?
So for the next event, and probably for all our events, it will be Zoom. Teams that are competing next week in either the Fulton 2 event, for those of you that are familiar with the signups, the hybrid event, or remote event number 1, or Fairlawn hybrid event. There's three events. There will be interviews set up on Zoom, and you'll be getting links for that. So that'll be our first opportunity to go through that.
Where will portfolios and control awards be submitted?
I knew this was going to come up, and this is why I said stick around, because Ron Therian in the next session, and then there'll be some more stuff sent out, and then there's going to be some examples and links on the website. This is actually done this year through the scoring system. The scoring system that you have access to, cloud-based scoring system, is also the place that you upload everything that you're going to upload. Okay, so you're going to be able to see some examples of that. There are already some examples, a couple of screenshots that are on the website, but this, again, is something we're all going to be learning. It is through the scoring system.
And while we don't have a question, one thing I didn't cover was Dean's List interviews, which I know will also be virtual this year. I don't know if anyone currently watching is applying, maybe someone will watch later. I think I did a Dean's List interview, and in person, it's not common to have a poster board like you have in a presentation. I took one anyway, but I think but in general, I generally don't like to have Zoom meetings of any kind where I'm the only person on the screen. So creating even just a bare bones presentation with some pictures of you doing different things, there are things you have to give, like they already have your essay, but you have to give the most opportunities for something to catch the judge's eye that you've forgotten, that they can mention what interests judges most. You're trying to effectively, it's an interesting kind of presentation where you're trying to cede control of the presentation to the judges, not take control of the presentation, because they're the ones who have the interests that are going to be judging you. So that's one thing to consider when it comes to Dean's List. The rest is just normal interview behavior in terms of just be modest without being diminutive to yourself, emphasize your achievements without being arrogant. It's a tough tightrope, but I'm sure all of you will figure it out.
Yeah, I wanted to something else that you reminded me of in the beginning of what you said there. Last summer we had a virtual event, the MTI, Maryland Tech Invitational. And I judged that event, and one of the things that impressed me, there was a particular team that used the lighting and cameras to really good effect. And they had a camera that was just on, they logged in another, user that was actually pointed to the robot. So they could move the camera to show things rather than trying to hold up a robot. And you won't have a lot of time to do that, but if you can just have something to give that view. I also judged in person where a team had their robot on a turntable, so that instead of having to do the, let me shift this around, and I just knocked the camera over, they could just say, this is our intake on the front and in the back. It was a very smooth transition. So when you practice, have somebody who's not part of your team, who hasn't seen you, watch and ask them, like, what's confusing, or why, like, what points didn't they see? And it may be that, like, well, I really couldn't, you were talking about this, but I really couldn't see that. You might want to think about not only having that additional, there's no reason you can't do it, have another user on Zoom, have another camera on Zoom. Also, it helps your other team members when they're talking about your robot and it's there, and you can say, and the one person who has it can then put it in the right position, so that nobody's really feeling like you're gesturing in the air, or you need to have just the pictures to talk about. Do remember that the portfolio is 15 pages. There's a limit. You can't put everything in it, but you couldn't flag your whole engineering notebook in the past either. So that's going to take some practice, and you don't want to just, the last thing you want to do is like show your whole portfolio. Well, the judges are going to see your portfolio. So, highlighting something that's there and showing them different aspects of it so that they'll be curious to go look at it, I think that would be the best use of the time. And as far as video, lighting is important. Rohit talked about the background. I would never do an interview with this background. My background is very distracting. And I actually, when we talked about it, I said, I know he's going to have a very plain background. I'm going to have my distracting background. And you guys can think about, like, what would you rather, what helps you focus more on the person talking, right? The clean background. Emma's got a clean background. I've got a very busy one. This is fine for me just talking to people in general, but when you're making a presentation, everyone needs to kind of think about that. I don't know how many people's basements and cluttered, extra spaces in their house I've seen. Okay, but that's not during a judging interview. So try to keep that as clean as possible, even if it means, pointing to a wall or something, rearranging something. I'm sure that you guys all have some suggestions that you'll be coming up with. It would be great for us to be able to collect some of these and share them at the end of the season, because, as we've talked about with many things that are innovations in this season, because we have to, who knows how many of them we may see again. And submitting video and doing things online allows us to interact with people in new ways. And, some of this may still be with us in the future.
Yeah. I just have a question for both of you in terms of what your presentation advice is for the PIT interviews, or the virtual version of the PIT interviews this season.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's another new thing. Rohit, talk a little bit about when judges come around to your PIT, like what kind of tips you would give about how to present yourself in that more informal environment.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because you don't want to seem too scripted, but at the same time, you do want to be scripted, in the sense that I think the most interesting thing when the judges come to the PIT is never the robot. And I think that's like, it's dissonant for the team, because the most interesting thing to them is the robot. That's what they spend all their time working on. You want to have as many non-robot props as possible. And those are often like, I know teams are working with different financial budgets, you have to reuse parts, but like if you have like old versions of things, those are fantastic to show to judges. Mm-hmm. And how the program has evolved. It's also, and I know PIT interviews are sometimes of various lengths. I'm sure that that's not true this year based on how things are going. Yeah. But it's also at the time that you should show your personalities a little bit more, talk a little bit about your origins as a team. But obviously, when you have a time limit, you have to stick to that pretty religiously. So I think those are some of the things to talk about. It all depends on like what specific award categories are correlating to that specific pit interview. I remember at competitions, you'd never know until like 2 or 3 minutes in, and then you'd have people scuttling behind the scenes to change the post.
Oh, go get so-and-so to come tell us. Yeah. So maybe teams didn't know that there would be pin interviews, and there will. So you'll have a standard kind of, for FTC, and we're talking about FTC here, and then the judges will speak to you a second time, or give you the option to speak with the judges a second time, and that should be part of the schedule that you get. When we talk about FRC, we everything's kind of still up in the air, but there are interviews or / video presentations for which the same guidelines would hold. And of course, the big interview that most teams will be thinking about is like their chairman's presentation, which towards the end, when you're doing the Q&A, kind of devolves into that less formal situation. So my advice would be prepare and have people come up with questions for you so you can practice answering the questions smoothly, but not too smoothly. Not like you have them memorized, but that you know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I know for my team, basically we would do practice interviews with some of the older members, and we would always change the questions up so that the teams just had an opportunity to kind of get comfortable with answering questions that were different without feeling like they had a rehearsed script for when they went into the actual judges. So that's a very good point.
Yeah, and my FRC team will have everybody practice kind of 3 or 4 general questions that are very typical, like tell me about your team culture, or what's the most outstanding part of your robot. Like everybody should be able to answer that without having to go, well, that's Mikey over there, I don't know anything about that. To have an answer and then say, but the person who's really the expert on it could tell you more is Mikey over here, and then pass it off. So kind of having everybody be prepared to take a question and then build on it, I think is a good idea.
Yeah.
And that's just in general.
Yeah, I think, and that's a really critical point. I think especially with these pit interviews, you should have different versions of the same presentation based on who's giving it, right? Because like you shouldn't have to sell someone else's favorite part of the robot. You should talk about your favorite part of the robot, and that's going to be different. Right. They're all interesting. Like I think just a little bit of rehearsal for each person personally, and obviously don't get caught flat-footed on like the most common questions. You should know what gracious professionalism means to you, that type of thing, right? But I think like just each person should bring their own personality to answering the questions that they answer, rather than getting some bureaucratic top-down team answer.
Yeah. And final thought, I know we're going to have to wrap it up, but remember, technical glitches are going to happen. Be ready for that. Just be ready. Somebody's going to flip out there, you're going to lose them. So have a backup. And that's a new thing this year, but be ready. I think you guys can do it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Rose and Rohit, for those awesome presentation and then awesome advice. I want to again thank today's this session's sponsor, Newport News Shipbuilding, for making this chat possible. We have a short video from them, so stick around and have a great rest of your day.